This is lesson 28.4, the end of empires. In other words, decolonization. Guys, this is a big topic, so I'll try to go through this as efficiently as possible, but keep in mind, this is just the highlights. So the question is, what led to decolonization after World War II, and how did the Cold War influence the process? College Board topic 9.3, the Cold War. We've seen this already. Explain the causes, events, and effects of the Cold War in the period following World War II, and here's how it relates to decolonization. The Cold War played out on a global stage and involved propaganda campaigns, covert actions, limited hot wars in, here we go, Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and an arms race with the threat of nuclear war. And we have College Board topic 9.9. It gets its own topic, decolonization. Explain the various ways in which colonial groups around the world sought independence from colonizers in the 20th and 21st centuries. The process of decolonization occurred over the course of the century with varying degrees of cooperation, interference, or resistance from European imperialist states. Despite indigenous nationalist movements, independence from many African and Asian territories was delayed until the mid or even late 20th century by the imperial powers' reluctance to relinquish control, threats of interference from other nations, unstable economic and political systems, and Cold War strategic alignments. Places: Asia, the Middle East, Africa, not to mention Europe itself, and the time frame is around 1945 to around 1975. Key concepts of the end of empires: decolonization, non-alignment, civil disobedience, apartheid, and neocolonialism. Key people of the end of empires: Sukarno, Charles de Gaulle, Mohandas Gandhi, also known by his nickname Mahatma Gandhi, Gamal Abdel Nasser, and Antonio de Oliveira Salazar. Introduction. Decolonization was a dramatic reversal of European expansion throughout Africa, Asia, and in the Middle East. And in fact, one of the big themes of European history between World War II and about 1989 is this issue of European contraction of power, contraction of influence. 50 nations were born in just 2 decades. Sometimes the transition was smooth and orderly, but other times it involved long, bloody struggle. Colonies were still a source of profit and national pride, especially during the recovery period after World War II. Once these nations got their independence, the Cold War came to their doorsteps. Both superpowers struggled to exert influence upon them. One question all of these imperial powers had was, how do we grant these colonies political independence but keep all of the economic benefits of the relationship? This led many critics to ask, is this decolonization or is it neocolonization? We were going through the Vietnam War during much of this time. Numerous European countries had Vietnams of their own. Decolonization and the Cold War. Why did empires collapse? The demand for self-determination, the demand for racial equality, and the demand for personal dignity. This process of decolonization actually started before World War II, and really even before World War I. It began with intellectuals and spread among the common people. By 1939, things were already going downhill for imperialist powers. World War II was just the nail in the coffin. The power that European empires had to rule was massively decreased by the time World War II ended. The Japanese Empire played a large role in shattering the perception of European superiority and invincibility in Asia, and we've talked about this already. If an Asian people could bring that much devastation down on these Europeans, including the British, the French, the Dutch, the Russians, the Americans, and the Australians, it meant something amazing. It meant that Europeans were touchable and beatable. Why did Europeans think they deserved an empire? Self-confidence, self-righteousness, feelings of superiority, including technical superiority, economic superiority, military superiority, spiritual superiority, moral superiority, and of course, our friend social Darwinism brings us racial superiority. World War I began to undermine that arrogance. But after World War II, Europe had very little economic power or moral authority left. The U.S. influence filled the European power vacuum after World War II. We Americans liked projecting ourselves as anti-imperialist. This was in spite of our imperialistic behavior in the Philippines and in Central America. The U.S. also wanted to extend its influence on behalf of democracy. The further you can spread it, the safer it is. Anti-communism with the Truman Doctrine and containment, and free enterprise. After World War II, Europeans faced dedicated anti-colonial resistance. Mao Zedong in China, Mohandas Mahatma Gandhi in India, and Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. Decolonization and the Cold War. Communist doctrine loves the idea of worldwide revolution against imperialist powers. Ending colonial exploitation was a top priority. Communist powers gave economic and military aid to independence movements around the world. The U.S. sold liberal democracy. We supported free market economies. We also gave military and economic aid, and this was part of our containment policy. So what choices did the Cold War give a leader of a new nation? There were basically three. He could choose the communist bloc, he could choose the liberal democracy bloc, or he could choose this thing called nonalignment. Present himself as neutral, play both sides of the Cold War to his advantage. And that was a game that had to be played skillfully in order to work. The struggle for power in Asia. Let's begin with the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia. The Dutch had dominated the Dutch East Indies ever since the Dutch East India Company had kicked the Portuguese out of the area back in the 17th century. They already faced anti-imperialism before World War II. Their leader was Sukarno. Many Indonesians have one name. Sukarno was an intellectual genius. He had a photographic memory. He was a longtime Indonesian nationalist. And he had lived under Dutch detention for 10 years when World War II started. Sukarno worked together with Muhammad Hatta. He was also very smart and highly competent. And he was Sukarno's extremely loyal vice president. Keep in mind, his name is Muhammad. Islam is the religion of Indonesia. The Japanese overrun the Dutch and took over Indonesia in World War II. FYI, the United States lost its first aircraft carrier, the USS Langley, as it was trying to deliver planes to the U.S. Far East Air Force on the island of Java. It was attacked by Japanese bombers. The invading Japanese freed Sukarno from his detention, and Sukarno collaborated with the Japanese throughout the rest of World War II. Then the Japanese left, and Sukarno declared Indonesia an independent nation in August of 1945. The Dutch said, not so fast. They needed Indonesian oil and rubber to recover from the war. They sent 2 police actions to try to stop Indonesian independence in 1947 and 1948. The first of these 2 actions was much more successful than the second. In the second, more than 62,000 Indonesians were killed, and the Dutch were highly criticized in the U.S. and Britain for their heavy-handedness. They raised the profile for the Indonesian cause. It was a struggle on 3 fronts. It was nationalist, it was Islamic, and it was communist informed. Communism offered a simple explanation for what imperialist powers had been doing to them for centuries. There were failed agreements between Sukarno and the Dutch. The Dutch always wanted to maintain control of certain good parts of the country. But the Dutch finally accepted total Indonesian independence in December 1949. Indonesian nonalignment. Sukarno and Muhammad Hatta put Indonesia first. Hatta called it rowing between 2 rocks. Indonesia accepted aid from both the U.S. and the USSR. Vietnam. Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos were known as French Indonesia. The Japanese had run the French out in World War II, And now that World War II was over, the French were back to reestablish their control. Ho Chi Minh defeated the French in 1954 with help from the USSR and from China. And the defining battle was the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. A truce was formed between communist North Vietnam and pro-Western South Vietnam. This truce was eventually going to break down and pull the U.S. into a civil war between the communist North and the nationalist South. India. India played a key role in decolonization. India was Britain's oldest, largest, and most profitable colony. The principal leader of the Indian independence movement was the Indian National Congress. It was founded in 1885, long before even World War I. Gandhi was only 16 years old at the time. The Indian National Congress formed the new Indian government in 1947, and it still exists as a political party in India to this day. Gandhi became the leader of the Indian National Congress in 1921. He was a British-educated lawyer, and he preached nonviolent non-cooperation. This included civil disobedience, usually in the forms of strikes, fasts, the boycotting of British industrial products, and supporting and encouraging cottage industries instead. The philosophy behind civil disobedience and nonviolent non-cooperation is simply this: imperialist forces simply cannot dominate a people without that people's cooperation. Gandhi was also a hard-nosed negotiator. By 1935, before World War II, the British government had agreed on an Indian constitution. This had taken several years of round-table conferences. The British despised Gandhi. Winston Churchill called Gandhi Hindu Mussolini, a huckster, an aspiring dictator, an atavistic spokesman of a pagan Hinduism. Churchill called civil disobedience a spectacle that put white people in danger. During discussions, the British would do anything possible to undermine Gandhi's negotiating power. They questioned his authority to represent India. They brought leaders of other religions in to obstruct Gandhi's agenda. They tried to manipulate the number of seats held by various social and religious groups in the Indian National Congress. They tried to award those seats to their supporters. They tried to bring communal division into the talks. And if Gandhi organized any protests during the conferences, he was arrested. Gandhi was totally inflexible when it came to World War II. He had no sympathy for the British at all. He was totally against the idea of India helping the British in any way. Gandhi's attitude was, if you want India to help you fight for democracy, get out of our country first, then we'll think about helping you fight for democracy. Gandhi didn't want to take a time out of the independence movement for the war. He felt World War II was as good a time as any to press the British for independence. Gandhi spent much of World War II in prison. He did write 2 letters to Hitler begging him for peace in 1939 and 1940, to no avail, of course. But Gandhi could not stop 2.5 million Indians from volunteering for the British Army. After World War II, the Labour Party took control of the British Parliament. They gave the Indian National Congress political sovereignty over India. The Indian National Congress that still exists today is a political party. It's also a social democratic party, and we talked about that in Lesson 28 too. Remember what the difference is between a Christian Democrat and a social democrat? A Christian Democrat is just right of center, and a social democrat is just left of center. What does this look like in India? Well, number one, it's secular. It's free from religious rule or teaching. Our own American forefathers understood the need for this. Government can force people to do what it wants, but religious authority can persuade or entice people to do what it wants. And these two things working in unison under one authority create a dangerously powerful force. As a social democratic party, the Indian National Congress stood for democracy, social justice, welfare, and Sarvodaya. This is the uplifting of all, particularly for the economic disadvantaged. And this is a particularly non-Hindu thing given the caste system. So Gandhi wanted one India with a government and a constitution that was religion blind. But that was not something that the Muslim minority agreed with. So one of Britain's last acts in 1947 was to split India into two countries, India for the Hindus and Pakistan for the Muslims. This partition of India was a disastrous decision. There was no line that you could draw anywhere that would put all the Hindus on one side and all the Muslims on the other. No matter where you drew the line, millions of people were going to wind up on the wrong side of it. So when India was partitioned, 10 million Hindus and Muslims had to pick up and move across the new border as refugees. As these two large groups crossed each other, going in opposite directions, they let loose all of their hate and resentment on each other. And the resulting violence may have taken as many as 1 million lives. To this day, India and Pakistan both hate each other. They're both very large countries. Pakistan is a country of over 200 million people, and both have nuclear weapons. What was India's policy after independence? 4 things: non-alignment, liberalism, democracy, and also joining the British Commonwealth along with Pakistan. China. There had been a civil war in China for years between these two parties. The People's Party under Jiang Jiechi, formerly known as Chiang Kai-shek, or as Truman nicknamed him, Cash My Check. He was supported by the United States. He was an authoritarian. And the Chinese Communists under Mao Zedong, also known as the Red Chinese. He was supported by the USSR. He had grassroots support. He was tougher. He was better organized. And he had promised to take land away from the big landowners. The Communists won in 1949. The People's Party withdrew to the island of Taiwan and governed the island there. The Chinese Communists adapted the hallmarks of Marxism to China's agrarian economy: 5-year plans, mass re-education, forced labor camps, and industrial development. Independence and conflict in the Middle East. Some countries, like Saudi Arabia, already had independence before World War II started. During World War II, the French mandate in Syria and Lebanon totally collapsed. The biggest issue in the decolonization of the Middle East was Israel. In November 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour issued the Balfour Declaration, and it stated that the British favored a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. At the time, the Jewish population of Palestine was about 11%. Balfour was talking about the formation of a religion-ethnic-based state as a replacement of majority rule. Such a state would be inherently intolerant of religious diversity. Why would Arthur Balfour declare such a thing? 2 big reasons. Number 1, World War I was raging, and there was no guarantee that the Allies would win, and many people believed that such a declaration would win worldwide Jewish support for the war effort. Also, the British were thinking of the Suez Canal in Egypt. The Suez Canal was of great strategic and economic importance. They and the French were running it, and it would be nice to have a friendly, powerful state right next to Egypt to keep the canal secure. Arabs were outraged by the Balfour Declaration. After World War I, the League of Nations mandated the carving up of the Ottoman and German empires to the victorious nations, particularly to Britain and France. The people affected by this didn't just sit there and take it. Syria and Iraq both declared their independence. Both movements were violently put down by French and British militaries. Britain took control of Palestine as mandated by the League of Nations. This League of Nations mandate contained provisions for establishing a national Jewish home, facilitating and encouraging Jewish immigration into Palestine, and this was the result of decades of deadly anti-imperialist riots, and violent conflict between Arabs and Jews. And this continued throughout World War II. By 1947, the British decided that they had had enough of Palestine and withdrew. The United Nations divided Palestine up into two states, Jewish and Arab. Why did the UN do this? They probably honestly thought that this would solve the problem. There was tremendous sympathy throughout the world for the Jewish people who had suffered so much at the hand of Hitler. And the protections of everyone's civil and religious rights were specified in the League of Nations mandate. The Jews of Palestine now had an actual UN-sanctioned map to use in establishing their new state, which they did in 1948. Israel declared itself a nation literally days before the Balfour Declaration was set to expire. The surrounding Arab states declared war immediately. That war lasted 10 months. The Arabs were defeated, and Israel took even more territory than was specified by the UN. And this created a 900,000 person Arab-Palestinian refugee problem for the region that has never gone away. Tons of Holocaust survivors streamed into the new nation. Since then, there have been a total of 5 wars between Israel and the Arab nations. Israel has won every single one of them, sometimes seemingly miraculously. One consequence of the 1948 Arab defeat was a revolution in Egypt 4 years later. The government was taken over by a man named Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser took the art of non-alignment to a whole new level. He managed to play the U.S. and the USSR against each other. He even got U.S. loans and then used the loans to buy Soviet weapons. In July 1956, Nasser scored his biggest play of all. He nationalized the Suez Canal Company, taking control of the Suez Canal for Egypt. The British, the French, and the Israelis were all going to teach Gamal Abdel Nasser a lesson and settle this with a military invasion. The Israelis actually invaded the Sinai Peninsula all the way to the canal itself. But the world outcry against Britain, France, and Israel was severe. The U.S. feared that if the British and the French went ahead with this invasion, it would play into the hands of the Soviets. We feared that Arab countries would then join the Soviet bloc in response to European imperialism. So the U.S. actually joined the Soviet Union in getting the British and the French to back down. And the Israelis left the Sinai. Nasser showed new nations around the world that this non-alignment tactic of playing Cold War adversaries to your advantage works. Decolonization in Africa. It was relatively fast. The process really didn't begin until about 1957. Most colonies became independent in less than a decade. It was also relatively smooth. Many of these nations joined the British Commonwealth. There were some notable exceptions to the smoothness. For example, Kenya had an uprising in the early 1950s called the Mau Mau Rebellion. The British were not quite ready to accept the loss of their African colonies at that point, and they brutally crushed the rebellion. But they did accept Kenya's independence 10 years later in 1963. South Africa was another exception. South Africa became an independent nation in 1961. At first, South Africa was a member of the British Commonwealth. But that became rather uncomfortable because of apartheid. Institutionalized racial segregation had been around in South Africa for decades. The name apartheid had been around since 1948. It was a central feature of their entire society. The Commonwealth had all these newly independent black African nations in it, as well as all these Asian countries with colored people in them. So the South Africans chose to leave the Commonwealth rather than give up apartheid. You may ask, why didn't the free world get together and shun these guys? Isolate them, reject them, refuse to do business with them until they came to their senses? And the answer to that question was, because you couldn't. There was a Cold War going on, And South Africa sits on massive reserves of critical strategic minerals. It's a long list of minerals, including platinum, chromium, manganese, cobalt, and a lot of others. And these materials have critical uses in alloys and in chemical production. The free world could not afford to lose that supply. And we definitely could not afford to force South Africa to look for friends among our adversaries, such as the Soviet Union or China. The Belgian Congo. Belgium was still getting lots of wealth from the Belgian Congo in the 1950s. Even many U.S. and Western European corporations had substantial investments in the Congo. The Belgians didn't grant independence to the Congo until 1960. Then they gave the Congolese government a mere 6 months to get ready, which was not nearly enough time. The new prime minister was Patrice Lumumba, and he lasted 4 months. He was also a practitioner of non-alignment, but he was unable to convince Western interests that he was not a full-blown communist, especially when the Congolese army attacked Belgian troops, and really when he asked the Soviet Union for aid and protection. So our CIA helped stage a military coup which assassinated Lumumba and installed General Joseph Mobutu as a U.S.-backed military dictator. Joseph Mobutu ruled the Congo until 1997. Mobutu was great at using his country's resources to line his own pockets and reward his supporters. He made himself one of the richest men in the world. He did absolutely nothing to bring progress to his country, and the Congo remained one of the poorest, most unstable countries in the world. French African colonies. For France, the question was also, how do we keep the economic advantages of colonialism? Continuing their civilizing mission, keeping access to raw materials, keeping markets open, keeping outlets for investment open, keeping jobs for people like teachers and engineers. One possible idea was assimilation into France. One thing France tried beginning in 1946 was the formation of this thing called the French Union. Their pitch was, you won't have the status of colonies anymore. Instead, you'll be French citizens. And all overseas departments and territories would combine to create a single French government under a single French state. All would be united by the French culture. Most former French colonies signed on with the French Union for the aid package that went with it. They had representation in the French Union, but the French Parliament made all the decisions. French Morocco and French Tunisia refused to join and became independent. And this worked great for places like French Guiana and Tahiti. French Algeria was not given a choice about joining the French Union. The French considered Algeria to be part of metropolitan France rather than a colony. Algeria had 1.2 million permanent white settlers, 800,000 of which were French. And they were called the Pied Noir. Many of these Pied Noir had been there for generations. Do we have territories abroad that we see as essentially American? Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa, the Philippines before World War II? Then France experienced a rebellion in Algeria. The rebel group was called the National Liberation Front, the FLN. They were inspired by two things, Islamic fundamentalism and communist ideas. Well, the Pied Noir expected the French government to come in and protect its citizens, which they did. The result was the Algerian War, which lasted 8 years from 1954 to 1962. It was long and bitter. Atrocities were committed on both sides. The FLN attacked Pied Noir civilians, and Pied Noir vigilante groups attacked FLN supporters. The Algerian War had all of the following: systematic torture, mass arrests, internment camps, and forced relocation. All of this was going out on the news for the world to see. So France was in a tough spot. They were getting a lot of negative reaction from the world and from the French people at home. But when they tried to negotiate for peace, the Pied Noir and the French army both threatened to rebel. France needed a savior to find a way out of this unwinnable situation. Guess who just happened to be available for the job? Charles de Gaulle. So he became president of France again in 1958. He was hugely popular. He supported the Keep Algeria French movement, and everybody was happy that he was going to provide some kind of a brilliant solution. De Gaulle shocked everybody with his brilliant plan for Algeria. We're cutting Algeria loose. Self-determination all the way. De Gaulle started working with the FLN to agree on terms for Algeria's independence. In all of metropolitan France, a referendum was held on Algerian independence, and the French voted overwhelmingly, 75%, to grant independence to Algeria. Even in Algeria, it passed by 69%. So de Gaulle had the overwhelming support of the French people. Pied Noir and French army elements formed the OAS, the Secret Army Organization. In 1961, the OAS staged the Algiers Putsch of 1961, an all-out revolt. It was led by a handful of retired generals without much of a plan other than to somehow force France into not giving Algeria independence. They killed a lot of Muslims, they took over the city of Algiers, and Charles de Gaulle declared a state of emergency. In France, they had to close all flights in and out of Paris. De Gaulle went on TV in his old World War II military uniform, and more importantly on the radio, and ordered the French people and the French army not to cooperate with this putsch. De Gaulle's radio address was highly effective. Every French soldier in Algeria had his very own transistor radio, and they took back the city of Algiers. So de Gaulle could appeal to them directly with his own voice and countermand anybody who was giving them illegal orders. In the end, Charles de Gaulle crushed the Algiers Putsch pretty easily. He told his council, "Gentlemen, what is serious about this affair is that it isn't serious." Algeria became independent in 1962. The Portuguese Empire. The Portuguese relationship with Africa went all the way back to Henry the Navigator. Portugal was the first European power to explore Africa. They were the first to conquer territory in Africa. And they were also among the last European powers to give up their empire in Africa. The regime that ran Portugal for over 40 years was called the Estado Novo, the new state, also known as the Second Republic. Portugal had been a national dictatorship since 1932. The dictator's name was Antonio de Oliveira Salazar. He ran Portugal as a conservative, authoritarian dictator until 1968. Antonio de Oliveira Salazar was one of the few autocrats who was extremely active in world affairs. He joined NATO. He co-founded several European trade and economic cooperation organizations. Why did such a dedicated nationalist authoritarian have such a worldly outlook? And what did it have to do with Portugal's empire? Salazar and his regime subscribed to two theories that pertained specifically to Portugal: Lusotropicalism and pluricontinentalism. Pluricontinentalism was the idea that Portugal's natural state was to exist on several continents as one kingdom. This idea went almost to the beginning of Portugal's empire. Lusotropicalism said that for various reasons, the Portuguese are the best and most natural colonizers. Those reasons include Portugal's climate, its culture, its Catholicism, and its multi-ethnic ancestry going back for centuries. Salazar took these doctrines a step further. He believed that if Portugal were to be, quote, dismembered by losing its colonies, it would be the end of Portuguese self-sufficiency and Portuguese independence. So for the Estado Novo regime, the colonial wars against independence movements in Angola and Mozambique were seen not just as an ideological struggle, but as a matter for national survival. Keep in mind that Portugal had been a colonial power for so many centuries, the Portuguese had almost never known a time in their national history when they weren't a colonial power. The Portuguese Colonial War broke out in 1961 and went all the way to 1974. The Estado Novo continued to fight even after Salazar died in 1970. By 1974, the war was very unpopular at home, and Portugal was very unpopular abroad. In 1974, the Estado Novo was overthrown by the military and the civilian population in the Carnation Revolution. The people would present the revolutionary soldiers with carnations as a celebration of the military coup. And the first thing the new government did was withdraw from all of Portugal's remaining colonies. Neocolonialism. What had changed at the end of all of this? Many African countries fell into civil war and corrupt authoritarian governments. Western countries were often able to increase their economic and cultural ties to their former colonies through special trading privileges, French and English language education. Some called this new paradigm neocolonialism. Neocolonialism argued that Western powers simply had new systems to do two things. Number one, undermine the political independence of former colonies, and number two, continue the same economic subordination of these new nations.